In the spring of 1921, a Swiss-French schoolteacher named Paul Amadeus Dienach closed his eyes in a hospital room in Geneva and slipped into what doctors could only describe as a mysterious coma. 1 year later, when he finally awoke, he carried with him something impossible: detailed memories of living in the year 2749 inside another person's body. In the months that followed, what he wrote in his journals would become one of the most fascinating and disturbing documents ever recorded about humanity's future. Paul Dienach was not a mystic. He was not a science fiction writer. He was a quiet educator who taught French and German in Geneva. Born in 1884 to a middle-class family, he lived a modest life devoted to language and literature. Those who knew him described him as gentle, disciplined, and deeply rational. He had no history of psychological instability, no interest in occult movements, no reason to fabricate elaborate fantasies. And yet, what happened to him in that hospital bed would challenge everything we think we understand about consciousness, time, and the nature of reality. The illness struck him in late 1920. It began with severe headaches and waves of dizziness. Within weeks, he fell into a deep, unresponsive state. Doctors diagnosed him with encephalitis lethargia, the mysterious sleeping sickness that swept across Europe after World War I. His family was told to prepare for the worst. For 52 weeks, Paul's body lay motionless in that sterile hospital room. His family kept vigil. Doctors monitored his weakening vital signs as month after month passed. But according to what Paul would later document, he was not unconscious. His consciousness had shifted 8 centuries into the future, to the 28th century. When he finally regained awareness in 1922, something had changed. His family noticed it immediately. There was distance in his eyes, as if he were looking at the present through layers of time. He spoke less, he rarely smiled, and he began filling notebook after notebook with hurried handwriting. He told no one what he was writing. He told no one, not his doctors, not his family, not even his colleagues when he eventually returned to teaching. The long coma had left his body weakened, and doctors warned him that his remaining time might be limited. Perhaps that sense of urgency drove him to document everything before it was too late. Mixing German and French in an almost coded structure, Paul produced what would eventually exceed 800 handwritten pages. He titled the manuscript simply, Chronicles from the Future. In it, he described awakening not in a hospital bed in Geneva in 1922, but inside the body of a man named Andreas Northam, living in the year 2749. The transition was abrupt. One moment there was darkness, the next he was staring at walls made of materials he could not identify, in a room illuminated by light with no visible source. His first conscious thought in that future body was pure panic. The people around him spoke a language he did not recognize, yet, strangely, he began to understand it gradually. They approached him with medical concern, believing something was wrong with Andreas Northam's mind. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that the consciousness inside that body belonged to a schoolteacher from 8 centuries earlier. Paul described the disorientation of inhabiting someone else's physical form. The body felt unfamiliar. Movements responded with a subtle delay. Thoughts seemed slightly misaligned from action. He felt like a passenger inside borrowed machinery, trying to understand where and when he had arrived. The world of 2749 bore little resemblance to the Europe he had left behind. Nations, as he understood them, no longer existed. Borders and nationalist identities had dissolved in the 24th century. Humanity had reorganized into a loosely unified global society, though Paul admitted he struggled to fully grasp how it functioned. There were no traditional governments, no police forces, no standing militaries. Society operated through voluntary cooperation and a system of technological abundance that had eliminated most causes of conflict. Even the physical landscape had transformed. Cities still existed, but they were nothing like the dense, polluted, vertical metropolises of his time. The cities bore no resemblance to the urban centers Paul had known. Buildings appeared almost organic, constructed from self-repairing materials that seemed to grow from the earth rather than being assembled upon it. Maintenance was virtually non-existent. Structures adapted, renewed, and healed themselves over time. Transportation had evolved beyond anything he could adequately describe. Physical travel was nearly instantaneous. People stepped through transparent energy corridors and emerged on different continents within moments. The sky itself was filled with suspended platforms and luminous bridges, structures that defied gravity and connected elevated districts across vast distances. And yet, despite this advanced technology, vast wilderness had returned. Forests had reclaimed territories once buried under concrete. Animal species considered extinct in Paul's era had re-emerged and flourished. The future was paradoxical, hyper-technological, yet deeply harmonious with nature. But what struck Paul most was not the architecture or infrastructure. It was the people. The humans of the 28th century looked physically similar to those of his own time, but there was a calmness about them, an internal clarity that felt almost alien. Their movements were measured, their speech carried little aggression. Conflict was rare. Violence was not merely illegal, it was psychologically foreign, a relic of humanity's primitive past. Paul observed them with the astonishment of an anthropologist studying a more evolved species. They lived significantly longer, often reaching 120 to 140 years. Advanced medical technologies repaired cellular damage and eliminated the diseases that had once devastated entire populations. As an educator, what fascinated him most was the educational system. Children were not raised under rigid authority or standardized control. Learning was fully individualized, designed around each person's natural strengths and curiosities. There were no standardized exams, no grading scales, no competitive ranking. The goal was not to manufacture obedient citizens or efficient workers. It was to unlock each individual's unique potential. Young people explored philosophy, science, art, and craftsmanship not out of obligation, but out of genuine enthusiasm. Education was lifelong. Adults regularly returned to structured learning in order to expand consciousness and deepen understanding. To Paul, this system felt like the inversion of everything he had known. In the world Paul encountered, the concept of work as he understood it had largely disappeared. Automation and advanced artificial intelligence had assumed responsibility for production, infrastructure, and maintenance. Humans no longer labored to survive. Instead, they dedicated their time to creative expression, scientific research, teaching, and personal development. The economy bore no resemblance to anything Paul had known. There was no currency. Resources were distributed according to need and desire, enabled by overwhelming technological abundance. Poverty had vanished. Homelessness no longer existed. The struggle for basic survival was a relic of history. With quiet irony, Paul observed that the socialist dreams of his era had indeed materialized, yet not through political revolution, but because technology had eliminated scarcity itself. But this utopian world had emerged from a profound shadow. In his journals, Paul described a period known as the Dark Centuries, spanning roughly from 2200 to 2400. Humanity had nearly annihilated itself during this time. The details were chilling. Overpopulation pushed Earth's resources beyond the breaking point. Wars erupted over water, food, and habitable land. Billions perished. Climate collapse rendered vast regions uninhabitable. Governments fragmented. Civilization teetered on the edge of total breakdown. The turning point came around the year 2996, what the people of 2749 called the Great Transition. Paul's descriptions of this era were fragmented, as though those he met were reluctant to revisit that painful chapter in detail. But from what he gathered, humanity faced a stark choice: continue along the path of competition, nationalism, and division, and face extinction, or fundamentally reconstruct society. The Great Transition was not a sudden revolution. It was gradual, painful, transformative. National borders dissolved. Competitive economic systems were abandoned. Even the concept of private ownership was redefined. Most difficult of all, humanity had to overcome its deepest tribal instincts, the ancient reflex of us versus them. And somehow, they did. This transformation, Paul wrote, was supported by something he called the superior mind network. Yet he struggled to define what it truly was. It appeared to be enabled by technology, but it was more than a system, more than infrastructure. It felt like an opening into collective consciousness itself. In the 28th century, individuals could, if they chose, share thoughts, memories, and emotional experiences directly with one another. Privacy still existed, it was respected, but the option for deep, unfiltered connection fundamentally altered human relationships. Lying had become nearly impossible. Misunderstandings dissolved instantly. Empathy was no longer abstract. It was literal, the ability to experience another person's emotional state as if it were your own. As Paul described the spiritual life of 2749, his tone grew more philosophical. Traditional religions had faded, but spirituality had not disappeared. It had evolved. The people of that era understood consciousness as the fundamental reality of the universe. Physical matter was seen as a temporary expression of something deeper and more enduring. Death was no longer feared. It was understood as transition. Paul described witnessing what he called memory ceremonies. Before death, individuals voluntarily shared the totality of their life experiences with others, allowing aspects of their consciousness to integrate into humanity's collective memory. Death was not erasure, it was integration. Individual identity still existed, but it was no longer perceived as separate from humanity or from the universe itself. This was not considered a religious belief. It was accepted as scientific reality, grounded in centuries of advancements in quantum consciousness and interconnected systems theory. Even as an educated and rational man, Paul admitted that much of this understanding was beyond him. The people of 2749 were building upon discoveries that would not occur until long after his own lifetime. By the year 2749, technology had reached levels that appeared almost magical to Paul. Energy was no longer scarce. It was clean, abundant, drawn, as he described it, directly from the quantum vacuum itself, through mechanisms he could not fully comprehend. Nanotechnology had advanced to the molecular scale. Matter could be reorganized at its most fundamental level. Nearly anything could be created from raw elements. Manufacturing was no longer industrial, it was localized, nearly instantaneous. Disease had not merely been treated, it had been redesigned out of existence. Human biology itself could be modified. Genetic code was editable. Yet these changes were approached with deep ethical consideration, never casually. But space exploration is where Paul's astonishment peaked. Humanity had established settlements on Mars. Habitats orbited Jupiter and Saturn's moons. Artificial ecosystems thrived across the solar system. Interstellar travel was possible, but not through faster-than-light starships, as 20th century science fiction had imagined. Instead, humanity had learned to manipulate space-time itself. Paul described it as folds in reality, shortcuts carved into the fabric of existence. Space bent, distance collapsed. He saw images of distant worlds, some eerily Earth-like, others utterly alien, different skies, different atmospheres, unfamiliar life systems. Yet beneath all this advancement lay an unsettling truth. Despite exploring the stars, humanity had encountered no other intelligent life. The silence of the universe disturbed them. Paul's time in the future was not unlimited. He believed he spent just over a year in the body of Andreas Northam, but time felt distorted. Some memories were vivid, others blurred, as if he only had partial access to the experience. Those around Andreas had no idea they were interacting with a consciousness from 8 centuries in the past. They believed he was suffering from a neurological disorder. They treated him accordingly, attempting to restore what they assumed was normal mental function. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. Paul wrote that he felt himself pulled back into darkness. Paul described the separation as a tearing sensation, as if an invisible force had begun pulling him backward, ripping his awareness from the body of Andreas Northam. First came tension, then unraveling, then a narrowing tunnel of consciousness. Light collapsed into darkness, and then he opened his eyes in a hospital room in Geneva, back inside his own body, weak, emaciated, fragile, muscles wasted from a year of stillness, breath shallow. Above him stood the tearful, relieved faces of his family, but for Paul, this was not salvation. It was devastation. He had spent a year in a world without war, without poverty, without the daily brutality he had once accepted as normal in 1920s Europe. Now he was back in a continent still trembling from the catastrophe of World War I, economically unstable, politically fractured, and, though he did not yet know it, standing just years away from even greater horrors. He had fallen from humanity's future into its wounded past. What drove him next was not fear, it was urgency. His health was failing rapidly. The coma had damaged his body in ways 1920s medicine could not repair. He felt time closing in. So he began to write, obsessively. For 2 years, he poured everything he had seen into notebooks, but he did not write plainly. He blended German and French, used coded phrasing, structured his narrative in fragmented layers. Why? Because he feared the information itself. The future he witnessed was not fixed. It depended on humanity's choices. He worried that revealing too much, too directly, could distort the timeline, create paradoxes, or even trigger darker outcomes. So he concealed the message within complexity. Not destroyed, just hidden. By 1924, his health forced him to leave Switzerland. Seeking warmer air, he moved to Athens and took a position teaching languages at an institute. The notebooks traveled with him. In Athens, he formed a bond with a young Greek student named George Papachatzis, intelligent, curious, open-minded. Paul recognized something in him, someone capable of understanding. As his condition worsened, Paul made a decision. He entrusted the notebooks to George and gave him a final instruction. When Paul handed the notebooks to George, he gave him one condition. Do not read them until after my death, and when you do not simply translate them. Think about what they mean for humanity's future. It wasn't just a request, it was a burden. Paul Amadeus Dienach died in the spring of 1924, just 3 years after awakening from his mysterious coma. He was only 40 years old. Official records listed tuberculosis and complications from encephalitis as the cause, but those who knew him during his final months described something deeper. A man who seemed exhausted not physically, but existentially, as if returning to the 1920s after witnessing the 28th century had become unbearable. He was buried in Athens, far from his Swiss homeland, a modest grave, few visitors. His name faded into obscurity, another forgotten casualty of a turbulent decade. But the notebooks survived. George Papachatsis kept his promise. He did not open them immediately. Perhaps he feared what he might find. Perhaps he respected his teacher's final wish too deeply to rush it. Years passed. When he finally began reading, he was stunned. The manuscripts were unlike anything he had ever encountered. Part travel diary, part philosophical treatise, part scientific speculation. The future described within was so detailed, so internally consistent, that it seemed almost impossible for one man to have invented it entirely. George spent years translating the mixed German and French into Greek. Paul had intentionally written in a fragmented, coded style. Technical concepts stretched far beyond the scientific vocabulary of the 1920s. By the late 1940s, the translation was complete, but George hesitated again. The world had just emerged from another catastrophic war, one Paul's writings had indirectly foreshadowed. Greece itself was politically unstable. Perhaps humanity wasn't ready. For decades, the manuscript circulated only among a small circle of academics and philosophers. Then, in 1972, nearly 50 years after Paul's death, a Greek publisher finally released it. The title, Tu Chronicos tu Melantos, The Chronicles of the Future. Even then, it barely made a ripple. Some dismissed it as science fiction, others as the hallucinations of a brain-damaged man, but a few readers sensed something else, a warning, a message from beyond time. Many critics classified Paul's writings as delusions. To them, it was nothing more than an elaborate neurological hallucination following severe brain trauma. They pointed to one major flaw. His timeline didn't match reality. Many of the advancements he placed in the year 2749 had already begun emerging in the 20th and 21st centuries. Skeptics also noted that some of his technological descriptions echoed speculative fiction circulating in the early 1900s, global societies, advanced energy systems, floating structures, themes not entirely foreign to imaginative writers of his era. The scientific community responded even more bluntly. Paul's claims were not testable. They were not falsifiable, so they were largely ignored. The book remained a curiosity, discussed among small circles of futurists and philosophers, but dismissed by mainstream academia. And yet, there were elements in Paul's account that refused to be easily dismissed. The timing may have been wrong, but the trajectory was disturbingly accurate. He described a world connected through instantaneous global communication, a network linking distant continents in real time. He placed it centuries ahead of his time, but the description mirrors the internet age. He spoke of genetic modification, of humans altering their own DNA, of artificial intelligence managing complex systems, of the danger of nuclear catastrophe, followed by humanity being forced into global cooperation. These were not mainstream ideas in the 1920s, certainly not expressed with the calm realism found in his writing. Even more striking were his near-future predictions. He wrote of a second Great War, more devastating than the first. World War II erupted just 15 years after his death. He described a planet divided into two competing ideological systems, one rooted in individual freedom, the other in collective authority. The Cold War unfolded almost exactly that way. And yet, Paul placed these events centuries later. The timeline shifted, but the pattern remained. He also foresaw humanity expanding into space, first temporary outposts, then permanent settlements. He warned that Earth's resources were finite and that infinite economic growth was impossible. Today, that argument stands at the center of environmental and economic debate. Perhaps Paul miscalculated time, or perhaps he underestimated how fast humanity would accelerate. Some researchers have suggested that the inconsistencies in Paul's timeline may be inherent to the nature of the experience itself. Perhaps consciousness does not perceive time linearly when it moves beyond ordinary reality. Events that appeared centuries apart to him may, in objective history, lie much closer together. Or perhaps something even more radical occurred. Maybe the act of recording the future altered it. Maybe documenting it accelerated certain developments and delayed others. Under this interpretation, Paul's narrative is not a fixed prophecy. It is a potential pathway, one possible future among many, a trajectory humanity might follow if specific conditions are met. But Paul's experience reaches far beyond prediction. Its true impact lies in what it implies about consciousness and time. How could a mind from 1921 awaken in a body in 2749? What mechanism could allow such a transfer? Paul offered no theory. He did not speculate, he only described. Some thinkers argue that consciousness may not be confined to the brain, that the physical body is merely a temporary interface. In states like coma, near death, or extreme neurological disruption, consciousness might detach from its ordinary constraints. It might move across time. Others propose a more symbolic explanation. Perhaps Paul accessed what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. Rather than literally traveling through time, he may have tapped into archetypal visions of humanity's potential future. In that sense, 2749 would not be a date, it would be a state of awareness. The spiritual implications run even deeper. If Paul truly experienced a collective consciousness network, then individual minds may not be as isolated as we assume. The boundary between self and other, between past and future, may be more permeable than we believe. For centuries, mystical traditions have claimed that time is an illusion, that past, present, and future coexist within an eternal now. Paul's account echoes that ancient assertion. If true, time may not be a line, it may be a field, and consciousness, a traveler moving within it. If Paul's account were true, it would not simply validate one man's experience. It would echo ancient intuitions, mystical traditions that have long claimed time is not what it seems. But it raises a troubling question. Do we live in a deterministic universe? If Paul truly saw the year 2749, does that mean the future is fixed? Are our choices nothing more than scenes in a pre-written script? Or is the future fluid, continuously reshaped by billions of individual decisions? Paul leaned toward the second possibility. In his writings, he emphasized that the world he witnessed was not inevitable. It depended on critical choices made at pivotal moments in history. This suggests not a single timeline, but branching possibilities, multiple potential futures. And our collective decisions determine which one becomes real. Modern readers often fixate on his description of the dark centuries, environmental collapse, resource wars, near extinction. Though he placed them in the 22nd and 23rd centuries, their echoes feel disturbingly present today. Climate instability, political polarization, nuclear proliferation, artificial intelligence risks. It feels as if we are edging toward a precipice. Some interpret Paul's writings as a warning. This is where your current path leads. Others see something stranger, a form of hope. Humanity did not collapse, it transformed. The question of reality remains unresolved. Did Paul truly experience a displacement of consciousness beyond our current understanding of physics? Was he a creative genius, constructing a deeply coherent speculative future? Or did illness reshape his mind, generating memories that felt utterly real? We have no definitive proof. Paul is gone. What remains are the notebooks, and inside them, a question. In the end, what remains are Paul's words and our judgment. Those who study his writings closely notice something unusual. Regardless of whether his account is literally true, it carries emotional authenticity. He does not present himself as chosen. He does not speak like a prophet. If anything, he sounds confused, frightened, overwhelmed by what he witnessed. His journals do not read like heroic science fiction. They read like the notes of an anthropologist trying to understand a foreign civilization. He doesn't only describe cosmic advancements, he records ordinary details: what people eat, how they organize their living spaces, the quiet rituals of daily life in 2749. That attention to the mundane gives his account a texture that pure fiction rarely possesses. Fiction tends toward spectacle. Paul's writings lean toward observation. If he could look at our world today, a century after his death, what would he see? We have achieved some of what he described: global communication networks, early stages of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration. And yet, we also display the warning signs he wrote about: environmental strain, political tribalism, the weaponization of emerging technologies. Many believe we stand at a critical threshold, a decision point, the kind that determines whether humanity moves toward cooperative abundance or slips into its own dark centuries. Perhaps the true value of Paul's account lies here, not as a prediction, but as both a mirror and a map. A mirror reflecting our capacity for destruction and our potential for transformation. A map suggesting that the road to an enlightened civilization may require passing through darkness, letting go of tribal identity, letting go of competitive obsession, letting go of the illusion of the isolated self. The vision of 2749 is not a prophecy waiting to be proven right or wrong. It is a possibility, one we either build toward or drift away from. The future is not written, not yet. The notebooks Paul Dienach filled during those desperate final 2 years still exist. They sit in archives in Greece, occasionally examined by researchers, largely forgotten by the world. His grave in Athens is quiet, rarely visited. He died unknown, his claim unverified, his warnings recorded but mostly ignored. And yet, his words endure, perhaps waiting for a generation ready to hear them. We now live in an age defined by existential risk, climate instability, technological acceleration, global fragility, and at the same time, an unprecedented need for cooperation. Maybe that is why the Chronicles of the future feel strangely relevant today. They leave us with an invitation to question, to imagine that consciousness may be broader, stranger, more permeable than we dare to believe, to consider that time may not be a rigid line, but something fluid, something navigable. Perhaps the future is not merely waiting to happen. Perhaps it already exists. And perhaps certain minds, under extraordinary conditions, can glimpse it through the fractures of reality. Who was Paul Dienach? What did he truly experience? We may never know, but he left us something: a warning, an inspiration, a challenge, and a comfort. 800 pages of impossible memory. And perhaps the uncertainty is the point. Maybe certainty is not what we need. Maybe the question is not proof, but choice. Because if the future is a possibility, then the real question is this: which future will we create?